Hey guys, and welcome back to part 5 of my tutorial series about React, Redux, and Webpack. So up until this point, we've handled background information about React. We've talked a little bit about how to build an app, what build tools to use, and we've shown you how to implement Webpack in a development environment and include hot module reloading. But that's kind of all boring, I think. It's really cool when you first see when you first see the browser update, your code changes immediately because of the hot module reloading, but ultimately once you set that up once, you never have to think about it again. The fun part is actually using React to build a web app. So we're going to start doing that. First thing I'd like to do, which I should have done a long time ago, a couple of videos ago, is get rid of this is not a React app yet header. Get out of here. It's totally a React app. So right now, all we have in our entry point, our client.js, is our app component being rendered onto the page. Right now, this app component is just a div that's saying some contrived sentence about our app. So I think in this video, we're going to make a couple components. We're going to have one component that's a parent component to some other components, and we're going to get to see firsthand how state and props relate to each other and how we can use them to pass data down in a unidirectional way to child components. So I thought that we would start this by talking a little bit about what I envision us building. So I'm going to head back to the iPad. Cool. So to start out, I figured we would start with just a text input. This is pretty standard thing on websites to be able to input some text. And then do something with it. Generally, this is some type of form where you're submitting, and so here I've drawn a submit button. Now, traditionally, we would put this input here. It'd be a DOM element on the page, and this submit button would also be, another input or maybe a button component. And ultimately, we would hook up an event handler on the button component, and we'd say, listen for a click. On click, we would then do something, and generally that something has to do with what text was inputted into that input element. So to do that, the function that we are running on a click, we would basically, I'm going to use the word pull out. I'm going to put in quotes. We're going to pull out the input, and we're going to pull out the text. I believe on an input it would be like if we were storing the input element in a variable called L, it would be like L.val or something. You'd invoke that function and you'd get the value that was inside the input function. And if you remember from one of my first videos, I said that this is kind of this is the traditional way of thinking about web apps, where when you do something, you have to go in and actually grab or pull out the DOM element that you want and do something with it. And in this case, we're letting the DOM and the browser keep track, or let the input do its thing. This is a DOM element. And then when we want to do something with the text, we go grab it, we go pull out the text, and we do something. This is a little bit different than how you have to think about when you're doing a React app, especially with an input. And so I think it's a great example. It's familiar enough of an example of inputting text and then doing something with that text. And yet it's a little bit different with React, so I think it makes for a good learning experience. So let's see how we want to think about this in React a little differently. So as you guys remember from some of my other videos, React abstracts away the DOM. So if this is the DOM, the actual HTML on the page, React sits here and is kind of abstracting away our app on this side from the DOM on this side. It's making sure that however we define components on this side on the left in the virtual DOM, they get updated accordingly in the input. Now, because of this, when you're building a React app, you don't ever really want to reach across here and grab something specifically out of the DOM. When something updates on the DOM, it's because React is updating it. So let's think of how we can kind of plug into this system so that we're not letting the DOM update and then grabbing something later, but we're actually grabbing it beforehand and telling React to update it. And so, yeah, I have a little bit of a spoiler alert here, but we're going to use state. So, back a couple of videos ago, I mentioned that this over here is called the virtual DOM, and that's because it's JavaScript, basically. And so even an input, when you define an input in JSX, sure, it'll look the same here, but it's actually, you can think of it as JavaScript. And so, same thing with the submit button. So normally you don't do anything when someone starts typing. So if they start typing a letter T, normally you don't do anything because they're interacting directly with the DOM. But in our case, we want to catch it before it ever gets to the DOM. So when someone starts typing into our input component of our React app, which again is just this JavaScript app running in this virtual DOM, we want to handle that before it ever even gets, before that T ever gets to this side. Let's undo that. So how do we do that? Well, let me free up some room here. I didn't do a good job here. Yeah, we know it's the virtual DOM. We know there's a button. Not so important. So normally we would only attach an event handler to the submit button for onClick. And then we'd go grab the input. Here, on this side, we attach an event handler to the input component. And we say onChange. OnChange means something changed. You added a letter, that's an onChange, that's an onChange, that's an onChange, or you delete a letter, that's an onChange. And so we're going to attach a function that fires every time there's a change. And what we can do with this onChange handler is we can update the state with the current text. So let's say this is a big component. I'm running out of room, but this whole left side is a component. We're going to call it text display. And we'll do this in the actual code in a minute. And within this component, we've defined a property on the state that we're going to start keeping track of. And let's just call it input text. And so what onChange is going to do, every time it fires, it's just going to update the state. And so currently, let's say, right now the way I have it written with TEX, input text is going to be TEX. But as soon as somebody types another letter, like another T, to make the word text, this onChange handler is going to fire. We've written the function to update the state, and so now state is going to be text. So we've kind of plugged into this, it's almost like a middleware, where as soon as someone types a letter, we kind of grab it and update state. But if we do it this way, we have to set it up in a way that React is going to mirror the state as opposed to what's actually being typed in. So the input component has a property on it called value, I believe. I'll have to check that. But this value, if you set it, like if you set it to be text, then this input will just always show text, and you can't change it because you've explicitly set the value to be text. So this allows us to actually change the value of the input without having someone actually type into it. Now, instead of setting the value to something arbitrary like text, let's set it to something that's based on state. Because remember, all components in React can be thought of as functions that take in state and output what they should look like. So what should this input, what should the value of the input look like? Well, it should always just be the state. We're updating the state every time someone changes it, and so let's let React just analyze and look at what state is and then display it in the text box. And so we set value equal to this dot state dot, and I called it input text, so input text. This means that whenever somebody types a letter or deletes a letter, we're going to fire on change, it's going to update the state. So this state is always going to be kept up to date with what people are typing, with what the user is typing. And if you'll remember, whenever state changes, React re-renders the entire app. So React's looking for child components, so this input is part of the render function of this component, because we're showing an input function, and it's going to say, hey, the property on input, the value attribute, is actually a function of state, and state just changed. The input text property of state just changed, so update it. And so on the screen, it will update. Now this might seem kind of backwards, or it might seem like there's a delay. There's not. This happens very fast. And what it allows us to do is to, when they hit the submit button, we don't have to go grab the DOM element, because that's slow as heck. We already have the text that they've inputted up here in state. And so we have a similar onClick handler over here, but the onClick handler doesn't have to go grab text from a DOM because we're already keeping track of it. So the onClick handler, this function, is just going to do something with this dot state dot input text. Apologies for the sloppy handwriting and lack of space. But I hope you can kind of see now how React allows us to abstract away the DOM and to think of everything in terms of state and props. And so we're going to build something similar to this. We're going to have an input that we can type in with a, we may add a submit button. We'll see how it goes. Eventually we will when we do a to-do app. And then we'll probably add something, we'll add some type of child component that is going to do something with whatever text is being put here. Yeah, so we'll get a sense of state and props. So let's go back to our code. Sorry about that. Afternoon coffee. Okay, so we've got this app component that's going to encompass our entire app, but we'd like it to do more than just say this sentence, which is great, but you know, let's get a little fancier. So let's create a couple components. Let's create one called text display. It's generally best practice to capitalize your components. Some people use JSX as the file type thing. I don't know, mind blank. But you don't have to, and I feel like more and more people are just using .js. They're assuming that build tools that they have set up are going to be able to compile the JSX to JavaScript. So there's no need to specifically single it out as a JSX file. So we are creating this text display element. Cool. Shows up here. So let's import React and component from React. We're going to have class text display extends component class. And then we're going to export default text display so that we can import it where we want to use it. As I mentioned, every component needs a render function. And let's just return a div here. Make sure we're doing everything right. I like doing this. Cool. Let's save that. Now we want this text display to show up in our app component. So let's change this div to just be the app component. Now, generally, or many times I should say, your render function is going to have some JSX and it's not going to be on one line. You're going to have multiple lines and it's going to look a little bit like HTML snippets. So unfortunately, you can't do this and then you can't like add something with this return statement with nothing here. So you have to make it, you have to add parentheses. Makes it look a little awkward, but this parentheses, just parentheses, I guess parentheses is single. This parentheses just allows the line to continue on the next line, and so you don't get an error. Now the other thing to point out here is that this would actually not work. The render function can only have one top level element. So having two lines, yeah. So I don't know if you guys can see this down here. But my ESLint is actually picking up on this, which is pretty cool, my JSX linter. And it's saying error, parsing error. Adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. So you can't have two sibling components at the top level of this render function. Wow, it's a big mouse. So what would work is if you wrapped it in a div or any component that you want, and then the error goes away. So this is actually generally what I do. I usually will wrap them in a div and I actually give it a class name of the class it is, usually lowercase. This is probably not a great idea since my ID of my anchor tag on my index.html is app, but it helps namespace it, and we'll get to that when we talk about styling. So one other thing to note is generally in HTML, class would be like this. In React, it has to be class name. React abstracts over the DOM. It also mostly abstracts over different browsers. So if you've ever worked with JavaScript before, you'll know that different browsers have different man, I'm blanking on the word, but they use different syntax sometimes, or they have different functionality. And so maybe you use one JavaScript function that is supported by one browser and not supported by another. Or for instance, browsers are adopting ES6 syntax at different paces. So some browsers may have support for certain ES6 syntax or functions, and others do not. So one thing React does is it abstracts over these, and so when you add like event handlers like on click, and then you have a function that will be, they'll allow you to have cross compatibility of the browsers. Compatible, that's one of the words I was looking for. Cool, so we'll get rid of this class name for now. Come back to it. So this is the app component. Basically what I want to do is I want to take this text display component that I created and make it a child of the app component. In fact, the app component is our entire app, so all of any other components are going to be children of the app component. So right now, the way this is written, there's no reference to our text display component anywhere. So how do you think we get it? We have to import it. That's why we are exporting it here, which means that we can just import it up here. Honestly, I wanted to call this text input. So in your mind, just imagine that I had done this from the beginning. Cool. So we're going to import our text input component from, and we give it a relative path. It's in the same folder, and it's called text input. You don't need to put the .js extension. That's the other word I was looking for before. File name extension. It'll look at it for you. It'll find it anyway without the extension. It assumes it's looking for either an npm module in the node modules folder or a .js file, JavaScript file. Okay, so now we have, it's going to import this so we can use it in our JSX. And we use it just as if it was like its own HTML element. So, don't need a space there. So we're going to hopefully see a div that says this is the app component, and then below it we're going to have the text input component. And right now this is just returning another div that says this is the text input component. So we should see 2 lines of text. We can make this, we can make this one a header, just so it's a little bit bigger. Let's save that, let's save this. I changed that file just to get rid of that original header I had. And so now if we do npm run serve, boom. We have the app component and we have the text input component. So everything looks pretty good. Now I think all these errors came up when the server wasn't running. Can we clear this? I don't know why that's not working. Anyway, one thing to note here is if you haven't already, you should definitely download the React DevTools. So it's a Chrome extension that allows React to show up as an option in your console, in your DevTools over here. What it does is it shows you all of your components and of course the JSX within each component. We'll get into this more, but what's really cool is that right now props and state, there is no state and props that we're keeping track of, but we can easily see them, and we could change them and we can see them changing in real time. It is a really cool way of doing that. One trick is if you use this selector up here to select an element on the HTML page, it'll take you to the elements page, but then, so if I'm on this one, right? Yeah, this is the text input component. And then if you go to React, it'll then open it up to there. If not, it'll always show you it closed off and you have to go and open it each time. It's a little trick. If you Google search React DevTools and first link is from React, they'll go into the release. It was in September. And then down here in installation, they have the Chrome Web Store or Mozilla if you're using Firefox. I'm not sure if they have tools for Safari or Internet Explorer, but if you're using those, then too bad. Okay, so that's great. Let's actually make something like an actual input. So in this text input, let's make this not just a div. Let's make it, whoops, what is that? Let's make it an input. Type equals text. Sure. The one thing I'm always really bad at is remembering all the syntax around forms and inputs. So I'm probably going to be wrong, and because I know at some point I'm going to be wrong, I'm going back to my, I'm cheating. Cool. So that's all we need. Let's see what happens with this. Ah, good thing we have hot module reloading working, so I didn't even have to refresh it. So here's our input. La-di-da, we can type in it. It's all good and dandy. But again, going back to what I was talking about when I was diagramming this out, we don't want it to be putting text directly into the DOM. We want to be catching the text and allowing React to update it. So I mentioned that we can set the value property on the input. All right, this is ugly already. Cool. So let's just add placeholder. Okay. And we'll set the value to be, and this will be in curly braces because we're going to evaluate JavaScript. This dot state dot, let's call it input text. That's what we're going to call it. At this point, we're binding the value of this.state.input text to the value. So this means that React is going to, whatever this.state.input text is, that's what React is going to display in the input, because that's what the value, we're setting the value of the input equal to that. So that means, whoa. Oh, okay. So here we're getting a nice error from React telling us that we cannot read property input text of null. And that's because we haven't initialized the state on this component. If you'll remember from a couple of videos ago, I mentioned that state can be held on any component. State can be used on any component, but you have to initialize it. Now, there's a couple ways of doing this, I believe. One way is with a getInitialState function, and this just returns an object that becomes the state. So let's just make this initial text. So the getInitialState is just a function that gets called when a component gets created and mounted onto the web page. And I know with this ES6 class syntax, there is another way to do it that we will go over in a second. I'm actually just curious if this getInitialState works. Nope. Cool. So in this case, we have to do a constructor function. I'm probably going to get this wrong. I'm definitely going to get this wrong. So I go back to the tried and true. Cheating. To be honest, you should never be ashamed of like having to look something up, or I mean, maybe in this case I'm actually just cheating. I'm looking at something I've already done, but it's for your help, so you don't get to cheat as well by looking at my prior code. So to be completely honest, I don't fully understand the context and the props, but what it means is that it's taking whatever's coming into this component and the context that it's in, and this is what React calls when it like needs to create this element, this component. It's going to take whatever props it's receiving and the context that it's in. I have to look this up more about what this is. And so you call super, which basically just passes it into, I believe, the component, which is like its superclass, and the text input is a subclass of component. So we're passing it into the component, and then we can do other things with it. So the one thing we can do is we can initialize state, and this is just saying this.state equals. We're not returning anything. You're setting a property on this, which is the text input component, and we want state to have an input text value, and we want it to be initial text. Save that, head back, boom, there it is. So here's our initial text. But if you'll remember, I've bound the value of the input to this.state.input text, and I've done nothing else. There's no way for me to change what the input text is on the state. So you probably can't hear me. Maybe you can hear the keys. I'm trying to type. I can't. So that's not good. So right now we just have this text, which is pretty meaningless in an already pretty meaningless app. So what can we do about it? Well, let's first take a look at this. So remember I told you the dev tools are really good for looking at state and props. So here we see on the text input, we see we have state and we have input text and it's initial text. That makes sense. Everything looks good. What's cool about the dev tools is you can go ahead and change it here. Hit enter and it actually updates it. So it's a little bit of a you can actually kind of debug if something's a little bit weird with your state or your props. But obviously we need a way for the user to update this. So how are we going to do that? Well, I mentioned when I was drawing the diagram out that we can place a handler every time something changes on the input. So what's happening when I can't type is I'm pushing a letter like space bar, and that would normally fire, it's firing an event called change, it's an onChange event. But because we've bound the value to be this.state.input text, it's never changing because it wants to change, but React says no, the value is this.state.input text, and that hasn't changed. So I ain't updating the input. So, but if the event is firing, the onChange event is firing because we are trying to change it, and then it gets blocked later on when it tries to actually update. So let's include an onChange handler. And we want to evaluate JavaScript, and we want to call a function. So let's just call the function handle change. and it's going to be a method on this class text input, on this component. So this means that we can just define handle change function. And for right now, let's just log out change detected. There it is. Man, sometimes words just don't come. Cool. So let's save that, head back. Let's go to our console. If we try to type change detected, see at the bottom here, every time I try to type, a change is detected. So we can definitely do something every time a change is detected. Let's, because this is a spoiler, let's log this. So if you're not familiar with this, I'm not going to go into it right now, maybe ever, but it is a little bit of a hard concept to understand, but it's a variable that gets assigned when a function gets run. So you can never be entirely sure what the value of this is going to be until the function gets run. There are rules where you can figure it out and you have a pretty good guess of what it would be. Let's just save this and let's see when I try to type. This is undefined. So it means that we wouldn't even have access to something like this.state. We wouldn't even be able to change this.state. And that's because this event is getting fired from the actual element on the DOM, and it's kind of, it's losing track of where it came from, basically. And so to do that, we want to bind this. Now when I type, this is the text input object. Pretty cool. So the other thing is this is still an on-change handler, an event listener, just like any other event listener on an HTML element. And so what gets passed into handle change is the event itself. And so we can console.log the event. And this is probably a large file, but target is null. Interesting. Event.target is usually the actual component or the element that it's coming from. So in this case, it would be the actual input element on the page, which is where we get the key. We'd know what the letter was that was being added. We would know what the current text is trying to be when they're typing. It's interesting. Okay, well, it's here. It is the actual input, like I said, and then we'd be able to we can intercept the value. So let's console.log e.target.value. And you can see that all these random letters after initial are present. And this is because when this event gets fired, when this handle change event gets fired, it has the updated value, the new keystroke added. But then when React, it tries to re-render itself, but React says, no, 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 no. I have your value and it's bound to something that I'm keeping track of. So how to get this to update? Well, pretty easy. We call a function that every component has a set state function. And this is how you want to change state. When you first initialize state, you just set it equal to an object. But when you want to change state, you want to call this .setState. This allows React to know that there's state changing and, hey, we need to do all these React type things like re-render everything. And basically with this .setState, you just pass in an object with the properties that you want to update. So in this case, we want to update input text, and we want to set it equal to event.target.value, which we saw has the updated value with the new keystrokes. Let's see how this does. Awesome, I can type in there. Really cool. Let's go to our React DevTools. Check out what it looks like over here. As you can see, every time I type, we're updating the state, which is being displayed over here. Really cool. So let's do something with this state. Let's not just, show it in an input because, well, boring. So let's make a new component. We're going to call this text display because this is actually what I wanted to call it. So I'm going to save a little time, do a little copy paste, call this text display. This is going to be a much simpler component. This is going to be what you would call a dumb component. Let's make it a div. And what do I want inside this div? I want to display the text. Whatever is being typed up there, I want to display the text here. So I'm displaying text, and then let's display the text. How do we do that? So if we want to evaluate JavaScript within JSX, we just use curly braces, and then we can say this, well, am I jumping ahead? Yeah, I'm jumping ahead. I'm going to display text. Cool, so we have this text display, and let's make it a child of text input, which means we want to import it. It's in the same folder. And so underneath the input, we're going to have the text display component. Now remember, this is going to throw an error because, well, we can't have adjacent elements without them being wrapped in an enclosing tag. So, whoops, let's enclose them. Error should go away. Cool. So now we have input, and below it we have this text display component. If we save this and restart our server, this time we have to refresh. There's the text display component saying, I'm going to display text. Now, how do we let it know what text it should display? We want it to display the text in the input. So to do this, since we're keeping track of it on state, all we have to do is pass down that state as a prop. How do we do that? Well, all you do is you make it what seems to be an attribute on this component. So we'll just call it text. You can call it literally whatever you want. Well, I'm not sure if there's weird symbol rules, but call it anything you want. We want to evaluate JavaScript because we want text to always be this .state.input text. What this means is that the text display component is going to have a this.props.text, and it's always going to be equal to this.state.input text, because anytime we call this.setState and we changed input text, or we change any state, React re-renders everything. And it's going to see here that we are setting a prop on text display that is a function, or that is dependent upon this.state.input text. And it'll update. So if we save this, we haven't changed anything about what it's going to show, but what we can do is we can go into here and we can see that the text input component has state, and it's dependent upon what I type in here. What we can also see, let's make this a little bit bigger, is that text display component, which is a child of text input, has a prop called text, which we've named text, and it's getting updated whenever this.state.input text of the text input component gets updated. This is how you build apps in React. You keep track of things in state and you pass them down as props. It's really as simple as that. The last thing we'd want to do on the text display component is display the text. And we have access to this.props.text, which is going to get updated anytime it changes. And let's see if that worked. There it is. And if we type in here, it updates immediately. So this has been an introduction to a very basic React app where we are keeping track of something in state and we're displaying it, or we are passing it down as a prop to a child component. This is a great start. I think for the next video, we may be diving a little bit more into how you'd want to manage state and why you might want to do it not on a component, but have its own system to manage state for the entire app. But until then, good luck, and hopefully I will see you then.